everybody. Welcome to AN's 7th regional short course in Miami, Florida. We apologize for the delay in getting started. We did have a prior session in the morning, but we're really happy to be able to open up some of our sessions here in Florida to the larger membership. And so for those of you joining online, thank you so much for your participation. I'm Miriam Elman. I'm the executive director of AN, and in the room are several of my colleagues from the AN leadership team, along with faculty members from across the state of Florida and from across the country. And we're spending 3 days together engaging on AN's issues. We're networking, we're learning about current Israeli and Palestinian politics and developments in the Middle East. And we're working together to develop strategies for countering anti-Semitism on campus and in the academy. And this is our first keynote of our meeting. And really, we couldn't think of a more appropriate speaker than Cary Nelson. Cary is a longtime friend and member of AN, and the relationship really goes deep. Cary wrote one of our first pamphlets in our series, and a few years ago, AN co-published with Indiana University Press Cary's seminal book, Israel Denial. More recently, Cary wrote the inaugural paper for our research paper series. And many of you know Cary. He is the Jubilee Professor of Liberal Arts and Sciences Emeritus at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And he's the author or editor of more than 35 books, former national president of the American Association of University Professors, and his full bio is in your program. It would take far too long to read it all. But it's hard to think, seriously, it is hard to think of a scholar who has done more to advance our understanding of anti-Semitism in today's academy and how we can best address and combat it. Cary's keynote is titled, "Does Academic Freedom Protect Anti-Semitism?" And he'll speak for about 20 to 30 minutes. We'll then open it up to some comments and questions. And those joining on Zoom are welcome to stay through the whole session, including the Q&A, but you will be on listen and view mode only. So with that, thank you so much for joining. And Cary, the floor is yours.
So my thanks to Miriam and the terrific AEN staff for making this possible, and to those of you in Florida for letting me disrupt your digestion with what I'll have to say. For your information, the people who are in Florida received the introduction, table of contents, and the second chapter of a book that I hope is about to go to a copy editor. And what I'm reading today is mostly material that I've actually added to the second chapter since I sent versions of it to AEN, in part because I felt that I really had not delivered a strong enough warning about the risks inherent in faculty participation in social media. I've read some of the recent books on social media, including Max Fisher's The Chaos Machine, which is a book that I recommend to everyone who's interested in the problem. And so I've sort of upped the level of intensity. In any case, that's what I'm going to be doing today. A few years ago, a well-known donor to Zionist causes approached me with a request to join him in a national campaign to fire tenured faculty who advocated explicit anti-Zionist anti-Semitism. I refused, explaining that I believed in and had defended not just tenure itself, but also anti-Semitic faculty who had job security, Ward Churchill amongst them. The donor was clearly very frustrated with me and approached me again a year or so later, making it clear that he would personally fund the project. This time I simply added that if I betrayed my principles, I would be of no use to anyone. He was, one may say, still more frustrated in response. Lacking an appropriate faculty leader, the project never materialized, which is why I don't give his name. It was not the only time my recent AAUP presidency had led to my being pressured to take positions contrary to my principles. Breaking the Silence, a group that I've supported, for example, repeatedly and intensively lobbied me to support boycotting Ariel University, since it's located on the occupied West Bank and is a potential impediment to a two-state solution. The first occasion was during a private tour of Hebron that Breaking the Silence conducted for me and a friend. Again, I refused, believing that opposition to academic boycotts either had to be absolute or it would fail as a guiding principle. However, as I'll make clear, I don't think academic freedom is an absolute principle. Indeed, unfortunately, increasing anti-Semitism both on and off campus makes it inadequate to rely on these principled stands alone in responding to faculty anti-Semitism. The previous work that I have done, criticizing both the BDS movement and anti-Semitic faculty publications, no longer seems to suffice. So I've been led to ask what more can and should be done about faculty anti-Semitism. I should begin by saying that the answer to the question in my title is a qualified yes. In many cases, academic freedom does protect expressions of anti-Semitism, at least from sanctions. But those protections are not absolute. This excerpt from my book tackles some of the strategies that I think we need to adopt in response if people have the courage and the determination to do so, and that's an uncertain question. The main challenge I want to emphasize today is that the problem of faculty anti-Semitism has been complicated immensely by the extraordinary escalating impact of social media over the last decade and more. As late as 2017, amidst national networks deluged with calls for genocide, Mark Zuckerberg predicted that Facebook would end terrorism, fight climate change, lift people out of poverty, and prevent pandemics. Maybe he had a longer list that he didn't get to. It would create happier and freer souls. Social media would engineer a new, more enlightened society. We can expect, I suppose, to see comparably unrealistic projections of our desires onto the metaverse. Zuckerberg damn well knew better, and others soon had the truth displayed indelibly. The 2017 Rohingya genocide in Myanmar was enabled on Facebook. In Sri Lanka, Facebook drove the violent 2018 anti-Muslim riots. It drove them every step of the way. Facebook hate pages operated as freely as newspapers, encouraging mobs carrying out mass murder. Both countries saw social media overwhelmed with a rising chant for blood, explicit and in unison. A 2018 UN report confirmed Facebook's role in promoting and organizing group violence, indeed of fomenting genocide. In Germany, 64% of people in right-wing extremist groups had been led there at Facebook's suggestion. Launched in 2006, Twitter by 2015 was suffused with revenge fantasies and conspiracy theories, establishing a culture of provocation. President Biden would bluntly declare that Facebook was, quote, killing people in 2021. Zuckerberg nonetheless maintained the utopian stance because it discouraged government regulation and distracted public attention from the social media reality. Social media is now responsible for enabling various communities' collective id. To do so, online hate provokes the psychological state of de-individuation that we've long recognized in mob violence. Hate speech is the glue that binds such communities together. Anti-Semitism is one of its primary forms, and zealous, morally outraged faculty anti-Semitism is helping to encourage it. The wider social effects of social media are becoming clear, and they are weighted toward disaster. Imagined to be a force favoring democracy, it's rapidly evolved to be the reverse. As a consequence, it is both delusional and irresponsible, as the AAUP does, to view social media simply as a neutral space for expressing personal opinions, a kind of public square where an absolutist version of academic freedom should prevail for faculty participation. Until 2015, there was a rough AAUP consensus that only extramural speech outside of faculty members' areas of teaching and research was fully protected by academic freedom. But in 2015, the AAUP decided that all faculty speech in the public domain was protected from professional consequences. I and one other member of the AAUP's Committee A objected, but we lost the debate. In 2021, a faculty member argued in the Chronicle of Higher Education that a faculty member who raved in favor of white supremacy could declare his ravings off limit for professional evaluation. Virulent anti-Semitism could also be off limits. We need instead to apply professional standards to online faculty speech that reflect the reality of how the medium functions in society. How many additional lives were lost to coronavirus skepticism after the Hoover Institution's Scott Atlas discouraged the wearing of masks and tweeted his November 2020 plea for Michigan residents to, quote, rise up in opposition to Governor Gretchen Whitmer's COVID-19 policies? What consequences does the Academy face when faculty members contribute to social media's system-wide reality distortion, its identity-affirming falsehoods, its subcultures of toxicity and hate, its doom loop of polarization and misinformation that culminate in calls for violence? Ferenc Huszar and his co-authors notably found that in 6 out of 7 countries studied, the mainstream political right enjoys higher algorithmic amplification than the mainstream political left. Yes, you can do progressive organizing on social media, but it loses the game to organizing infused with hate. The existing algorithms on social media platforms favor emotionally charged expressions of moral outrage. Research has shown that every single such charged word in a post increases distribution by 20%. 5 such words, 100%. The contributing prejudices like anti-Semitism are typically already present in a society. But the algorithms persuade more people that they are valid, and they create new affinity groups by drawing together people with different conspiracist beliefs, mashing hostile tribes together into larger hate groups. The online moral outrage against Israel that many faculty members expressed during a series of wars with Hamas thus helped give license to numerous bizarre anti-Semitic fantasies. Rational critique of Israeli policies and practices, I emphasized, did not have the same power, as the algorithms would not prioritize dissemination of rational analysis. The algorithms reward inflammatory rhetoric. This algorithmic alternative universe has made the claim that fierce anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism can be kept separate from one another obsolete. The internet blends them together. What When evil intent is vehemently ascribed to the Jewish state, it implicates Jews worldwide. So Israelis are accused of committing genocide in Gaza, and soon they're imagined to be responsible for the COVID pandemic. When Congress passed a stimulus package in 2020, the most shared posts on Twitter reported falsely that the bill siphoned $500 million meant for low-income Americans to Israel's government. From there, the cry that Jews will not replace us, that they aim to erase our culture, requires no conceptual leap. The news about a Jewish plot to dilute the white race spread in company with hyperbolic anti-Zionism. The claim that Zika was a Jewish plot was already in circulation. The QAnon movement would lump together traitorous Democrats and Jewish financiers among the enemies to be eliminated. Reddit's hate communities included, quote, watch niggers die, and, quote, gas the kikes. The Southern Poverty Law Center called Reddit a worse black hole of violent racism than Stormfront, the notorious neo-Nazi site. All this justifies, and I think mandates, giving greater weight to social media activism in a faculty member's areas of teaching or research during personnel decisions, particularly when faculty members become super posters, super spreaders who pull the platform toward defining tendencies of dogmatism, narcissism, aggrandizement, and cruelty. Super posters, then, are not super posters because they're more thoughtful, ordinarily a principle for understanding faculty activity, but they do drive engagement. Faculty aren't necessarily guided by rational calculation if they're tempted to achieve super poster status. Anti-Zionists, propelled by moral outrage, may feel psychological warrant to discount any personal impulse towards social media's version of celebrity, instead rationalizing celebrity as a supremely righteous political intervention. There's growing recognition among journalists that social media has become a corrosive force across the world. Academics who specialize in media studies and those NGOs that work to combat the spread of hate speech and disinformation reach the same conclusion. A rear guard in the academy has decided it is consequently time to double down on the faculty right to say whatever they please online, consequences be damned. Contrary to that misguided impulse, it's essential that both faculty members and administrators are free not only to condemn faculty dissemination of both hate speech and disinformation, but also to impose consequences in some contexts. Willful disregard for the responsibilities accompanying academic freedom will eventually prove unsustainable. Now, it is true, algorithms can be tweaked to reduce their destructive potential, but companies are well aware that doing that may decrease time spent online and thus reduce ad revenue. In the end, only fundamental repurposing and restructuring of social media will suffice to perform it. So long as the current business model, which militates against content moderation, is enforced, hate speech will prevail. So I side with former Facebook employee Frances Haugen in her congressional testimony: turn off the algorithms. Turn them off. There's no other solution. As the Center for Countering Digital Hate, CCDH, points out at the outset of its STAR framework brief, urging a global standard for regulating social media, a handful of companies owned by a small coterie of big tech billionaires, of course, Elon Musk is now the worst, dominate internet content. And the communities on these online platforms, their behaviors and beliefs, and the values which emerge from those spaces increasingly touch every aspect of offline society. Hiding behind the techno-utopian halo of online technological innovation, they have both hidden the banal atavism of their core business models and avoided real scrutiny of the harms they cause. For years, their CEOs, including Meta's Mark Zuckerberg, simply lied before the US Congress, promising a level of content management they never actually delivered, while in reality, proliferating hate drove online engagement and thus attracted paid advertisers eager to reach more consumers. Harmful content, that is hate and disinformation, is high engagement content. Anti-Semitism and other forms of hate generate profits. In fact, companies are often unaware that their ads are placed on misinformation and hate sites by firms that they've subcontracted to place their ads. The news media regularly excused congressional gullibility by referencing the media ignorance of Congress's aging leadership. But that easy excuse hid the much stronger American preference for not sanctioning the unregulated greed of late capitalism's new breed of robber barons. For that reason, along with absolutist American investments in First Amendment, there's more reason to look to the European Union for practical ways to regulate social media. The EU's Digital Services Act, which received parliamentary approval in October 2022, sets standards for disclosure of algorithms, elimination of disinformation, combating hateful content, and regulating advertising on large platforms. We'll see. CCDH argues that we can't continue on the current trajectory where bad actors opportunistically weaponize and poison the information ecosystem. For the Academy, we need to deal with the fact that some of those bad actors, witting and unwitting alike, are faculty members. CCDH argues that for social media companies and their platform, self-regulation means no regulation. Academia has long insisted that it can and must regulate itself. How much longer we have to prove that principle applies to academic participation in the wild west of the internet, I can't say. But I do believe the future of academic freedom may depend on our acting before long. In my book, I argue that there are several points in faculty careers where active anti-Semitism can justify serious consequences. First of all, you don't have to hire an anti-Semitic faculty member. A faculty hiring committee is not only seeking a teacher and researcher, it's also seeking a colleague and community member. Anti-Semitism can and should be disqualifying. Second, a tenure review can consider whether a faculty member's teaching or research is substantially anti-Semitic. I believe persistent, emphasize persistent, anti-Semitic social media activity can also be a deciding factor in voting against a positive tenure decision. But of course, not if you follow the AEUP's new rule. Third, a promotion to full professor review can also take anti-Semitic teaching, research, or public speech into account. There are multiple other points, short of being fired, when anti-Semitic activity can justify negative consequences, even for a tenured faculty member, from annual salary decisions to sabbatical leave applications. So the point in that case is to establish that faculty anti-Semitism has professional consequences, short of termination. At the same time, none of these personnel decisions should take place without long-term campus commitments to educating about anti-Semitism. I argue in detail that adoption of the IRA working definition can make a major contribution toward that education. The attacks on IRA have warned against consequences that have not materialized. People fantasize, that the sky will fall. It hasn't fallen. Nonetheless, I've taken the attacks against IRA seriously. And so I've crafted a policy statement that institutions could use to govern how IRA can be used. And I recommend that institutions adopt a principle like this in combination with IRA. Those, of course, who use attacks on IRA as stalking horses for their own anti-Semitism are not going to be persuaded by what I think is a rational and well-guarded policy statement. But those rational actors who are open to discussion may find this convincing. And this was in the chapter and can also be shared on your screens for those who are joining by Zoom. So this is the statement I'm recommending, subject to revision. The university formally adopts the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism as its official guide to identifying, analyzing, and combating examples of anti-Semitic speech and action. In doing so, we endorse the definition's important qualification that full understanding of potentially anti-Semitic statements requires an account of the context in which they were made. That will often require knowledge of the long history of what has been called the longest hatred, its strategies, metaphors, consequences, and contemporary manifestations. We also join with the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance in specifying that the definition is a non-legally binding document. Thus, it will not be used on campus as a quasi-legal invitation to disciplinary proceedings against students, staff, or faculty. But we believe its 11 examples provide an extremely helpful guide to the major forms of contemporary anti-Semitism, and thus offer substantial assistance in understanding their increasing presence both here and abroad. The goal of the working definition is not to shut down conversations, but rather to illuminate them with understanding. The definition cannot be used to prevent anti-Semitic speech from occurring, but it can be used to help reach consensus about which statements merit condemnation. That will help alert us to broader patterns of anti-Semitic speech that require a coordinated response. So that is one of let's see, where am I with this? Can I get to the second statement? Yeah, there, of course, in May 2021, we saw over 100 academic departments, beginning with women and gender studies departments, adopt pretty strongly anti-Zionist and I thought anti-Semitic statements condemning Israel that broke new ground in departments issuing political statements on contested matters. So I've also drafted a short statement that universities could use to prohibit those kinds of political statements. And in fact, just yesterday, I added a sentence, the second sentence to this thing as I keep thinking about it. So this is the proposed policy on department political statements. The university or college prohibits academic departments, programs, and other administrative units from issuing collective statements on contested political topics. Of special concern are issues about which not only the country, but also many college campuses are deeply divided. This policy is designed primarily to protect the right of individual faculty members and voluntary faculty groups to issue such statements without the coercive effect produced by formal department endorsement of one political perspective. The right of individual faculty and voluntary faculty groups to express political opinions is guaranteed by academic freedom. Administrative units do not possess the same freedom to address contested topics in their collective capacity. The policy also guards against the possibility that members of the public will conclude that administrative unit statements on contested political topics represent the views of the administration as a whole, of the institution as a whole. Disclaimers included with such political statements cannot prevent either of these consequences. Again, this kind of statement, it won't be easy to get either of these statements in place, though I do like to think that at least the IRA one might be something that even people who had previously been anxious about IRA might be willing to see solves their problems, because it does specify how the IRA working definition can and cannot be used. So it prevents it from being misused in the specific ways that the statement outlines. In this case, I think in the case of the policy on department political statements, there'd have to be probably a pretty aggressive debate with humanities departments before you could get this taken. Now we can go to questions and comments, and happy to have any criticism or suggestions whatsoever.
Thank you so much, Cary. Thanks so much. That was incredible as usual. Gave us a lot of information. We have your handouts. We have your book chapters forthcoming, and now the floor is open to our group. Yes, Terry.
Hello, Cary.
Hi.
I'm Terry from University of Central Florida. In looking at this proposed text, and I understand it's a single double-sided document. Were there other statements from other NGOs or other organizations that you looked at that made this particular statement your preferable model?
Well, I was following closely and reading things and underlining, and there also was, I chair a group called the Alliance for Academic Freedom that has debated these issues quite a lot. And so both indirectly, at least, there was a lot of input from the comments that our members made. We have a pretty lively debate, ongoing debate, sometimes exhausting, but often lively. And then I did also, in the case of the IRA definition, I sent that text to the AAF Executive Committee, 6 or 7 people, to get any responses that they had. And I built those responses in, and I thanked them somewhere. I thanked them in the preface to the book. But there weren't any good, concise statements in either case. In the case of the question about departmental political statements, there were a lot of essays and op-eds on that subject. And I have a colleague in the College of Law here in Urbana who shares my passion on that particular issue. And so I've been back and forth with him actually for a couple of years about this issue. And I quote some of his reasoning in the book. He worked out the detailed, really, I think, definitive reasoning on why disclaimers won't help. The physics department says that Israel is an apartheid state, and then at the bottom says, this is not an official university statement, but
Right.
The whole purpose of trying to leverage your department's authority goes to the opposite effect. So I think he really talked into Claire in detail, and I use in the book a paragraph from a letter that he sent to the Campus Committee on Academic Freedom, saying why disclaimers were worthless. They don't convince anybody, least of all members of the public. I mean, I don't think non-academics are necessarily even able to think about why a disclaimer from a university policy statement that says it's not university policy is anything other than a kind of Orwellian doublespeak that doesn't count for a damn. So there's been a lot of indirect and conversational input, but I don't have concise statements. Obviously, the University of Chicago's Calvin statement has been influential on the issue of department political statements, and that's been kind of the or text for objection to departmental political statements. I refer to it, and pretty much everybody who objects to departmental political statements refers to the Calvin statement, Cary's the imprimatur of Chicago. But anyway, so that's gives you a sense of the context for that work.
Thank you.
Rob?
Hi, Cary. I'm from Indiana University, McKinney School of Law. Say hello to Richard. So I know here where you sort of disclaim lawness in the
Or I disclaim what I couldn't hear.
lawness, the legality for the
Oh, right.
the working definition. So where's the law here with respect to university statements? And is there a legal distinction between university statements and departmental statements?
I don't think so. I mean, the phrase non-legally binding, of course, comes from the IRA statement itself. And it's a slightly weird formulation. But I think it was chosen advisedly, the phrase non-legally binding. And I think they want to just lay down a marker that that's not what the statement is. And they use it, I think, that phrase because they want to go beyond a descriptive modifier to a classificatory modifier. That is, they want you to think non-legally binding is a specific discursive category, rather than just saying it's not legally binding. They want a category distinction. I think that's why they chose it. I mean, I don't know. I do know people who were involved at all stages of the EUC and IRA definition. I actually haven't asked them that particular question, but I think that's the motivation behind it. I don't think that there's any legal distinction outside universities themselves between, say, department statements and university statements. I mean, the major legal distinction that operates in the United States is between public and private universities. So whatever external limits operate don't much operate on private universities, but First Amendment rights apply to public universities, and so they're operating with that illusion. And I think, as many people have remarked in recent years, academic freedom gets confused with the First Amendment rights. They can't be kept entirely separate. I mean, some people would like to think those are really entirely separate categories, but obviously they have influenced academic freedom in the sense of what can and cannot be regulated, and what speech can be constrained or sanctioned is influenced by First Amendment law, even if it doesn't directly apply. But I don't know of any explicit external legal differentiation between different levels of administrative statement that universities could make, that is, departments versus schools versus the entire campus and so forth. I mean, if that exists, I'd love to learn about it. I don't know of it, and my law professor companion in Illinois hasn't alerted me to that. And I haven't talked about to the one or two law professors who are virulently anti-Zionist that we happen to have in town, but I do know who they are.
Well, just to follow up, I mean, and so if you're drawing this distinction between university statements and departmental statements, is that a legal distinction or is that something else?
I think all I am suggesting is that administratively, department level statements amount to implicitly university sanctioned statements. That is, they have that implication because departments are agents of the administration. Departments answer to the administration. In many cases, what they can and cannot say and do, the areas of their responsibility, the areas of their restraint, the areas of responsibility, all of these are negotiated, through campus agreements. They vary from campus to campus. They certainly vary from public and private institutions, where departments may have distinctly less maneuverability at private institutions than they do in public institutions. But I think those are all negotiated. In a way, it's very much comparable to shared governance. Shared governance, the faculty role in governance, is a negotiated matter. The AUP has issued statements about it, of course, but there's no universally guaranteed boundary lines and principles of shared governance that necessarily apply across all campuses in the United States, let alone on planet Earth. Shared governance does not have the level of universality that academic freedom does. It's a much more contingent category of work, and certainly there's been some effort, most notably, unfortunately, on my own campus. My own campus has broken poisoned ground more than once over the 50 years that I've been here, and they are often leaders in bad decision making. The former president of University of Wisconsin said that University of Urbana-Champaign receives the worst legal advice of any research university in the country, and has been uniquely willing to try to eliminate First Amendment rights on campus. I could go into those details if you like, but they've sort of broken ground in confusing the relationship between department rights to issue statements of some kind and guarantees of shared governance. And so our provost tried to say that unless, he did say actually, that unless departments were given freedom to make political statements, shared governance would be undermined. And this was just, I of course wrote him a letter that, said, you don't know what you're talking about. And I didn't even get a thank you for your input that time. I mean, that's just nonsense, but there it is.
Cary, we have about 6 in the room that want to ask you questions, and that's an indication of how strong the talk was and how important the conversation is with you. I'm wondering first, would you be willing to stay a few extra minutes?
Oh yeah, of course.
Okay, wonderful. So we'll stay
Oh,
on.
we started late, so these aren't really extra minutes.
Yes. And then for those who are joining, who joined this hour, our members on Zoom, as well as some of our colleagues from partner organizations and some of our steadfast supporters at AAN, thank you so much for joining. I realize you may need to head out, but we'll continue a bit longer, and thank you so much for being gracious about that, Cary. So next on my list is David, actually.
People should feel free to email me with questions and complaints and whatever. I'm a great believer in fixing things before they're published, and that way you don't in a book review people telling you how lousy they are. So I welcome criticism beforehand, not once it's published, but beforehand.
David, go ahead.
I have 2 quick questions. One, a matter of procedure, another matter of degree. So you're arguing, as I understand it, that social media accounts should be taken into account, or could be taken into account in hiring decisions. When I participated as a chair and chairing the hiring decision, we were directed by the administration at the behest, as they presented, of the lawyers, specifically not to look at social media.
Yeah.
So now, there's a whole different reasons as to why you might disagree with that advice. I want to just tactically and legally. Secondly, your statement is that university colleges prohibits academic departments, et cetera, from contested political topics. how far would that extend? In other words, I was thinking, for example, at University of Virginia, the white supremacist march, would particularly like departments that's their charge, that's their subject matter, where they prohibit it, because that would be contested under some definition. I mean, perhaps millions of Americans who agreed with that march.
Yeah, and what school are you from, by the way?
David Kaplan, I'm from Southern Methodist University.
Okay. So anyway, you might email me with that information about barring search committees from taking social media into account. That might reflect someone having read the AAUP's decision since 2015. Not sure, but I think that's quite interesting. Of course, the thing is, look, when in a hiring committee, you can vote against a candidate because you think they make a lousy colleague. You just think that their attitudes toward the profession are, and especially at a relatively small school where having an impossible colleague can really do a department in. In a large institution like mine, if a faculty member becomes impossible, they bar him from entering the building and, give him an office in the stock pavilion somewhere. And, he's less of a problem, he or she, I should say, in all fairness. So, I think search committees don't have to declare what their motivations are. And certainly individuals on search committees don't have to declare. And if they do declare them, they don't have to be honest about it. It doesn't operate that way. So even if a school prohibits it, it could influence your attitude. But I think part of this reflects an environment in which we haven't, especially academics, haven't recognized how dangerous social media can be. And I think part of what's interesting in the case of anti-Semitism is the possibility that a faculty member's statements of moral outrage about Israel then get drawn into the maelstrom of highly damaging anti-Semitic convictions, calls for violence, and so forth. And, most search committees are not in the slightest way capable of evaluating that. That is, evaluating what happens algorithmically to a faculty member's social media contributions and what role those social media contributions might play in broader social phenomenon, including calls for violence. So, we're going to have education about that. We're going to have some participation, I think, if we want to deal with it, of people who have expertise in analyzing social media effects and the way that they're spread and escalate. So a full consideration of a faculty member's aggressive social media presence is something I think we're not even yet prepared to do. We're not prepared to analyze it, but I think we're going to have no choice to begin thinking about it at some point. But I'm really interested that an institution has decided to specifically prevent that, which, how can you judge what sort of colleague the person is going to make, what role they will have on campus and in your department, if their entire social media presence, perhaps exposed to tens of thousands of people or even more, is off the table, right? I mean, to me, it makes sense.
Far be for me to defend administration, but I think they're arguing against implicit bias. And that's why also your kind of argument, I think they push back very strongly against setting the criteria ahead of time and sticking to it. This is part of a larger DEI initiatives. In other words, don't start saying things like that, because collegiality has often been used to discriminate or bar people from certain backgrounds. So exactly the criteria that you're offering to violate secretly the administration's policy is the reason why they would argue that the policy is needed, I think.
Well, I mean, my role in search committees, many of which I chaired, was to do exactly as I damned please in every circumstance whatsoever. But that was sometimes a little bit controversial. I think that one of the, I draw a distinction between rational critique, even rational anti-Zionism versus aggressive, pernicious anti-Zionism. And it's really notable that level-headed critiques of Israeli policy don't get taken up by the algorithms and sent all over the place, right? It's only when you succumb to moral outrage and you succumb to really hostile vocabulary that it has those effects. So I think you are partly protected against viewpoint discrimination because it's not viewpoint, it's mode of expression that really makes the difference. And I think mode of expression is an important part of evaluating a faculty member's character, his or her capacity to think rationally, and so forth. I think that's, mode of expression certainly affects how you evaluate publications. But I think we have to guard against viewpoint discrimination, but that's not really precisely what's at stake if what you're asking is whether the social media activity really causes significant damage. If what you've to be taken up by the algorithms, you have to be nasty. I mean, you can organize and you can politicize in more affirmative ways, and you're just not going to have the same impact in social media. It doesn't drive engagement in the way that hostility does. So I really think that's the issue. But I think if the conclusion is you can't hire an absolutely proven son of a bitch without noticing that, taking account of that, is a little bit misguided. It's a colleague. I mean, I've been here a long time, and so I have friends in lots of different departments, and I've had to deal with, or certainly recognize, people who are hugely destructive to a department's well-being, and you have to be able to consider that, especially in a hiring decision. Tenure decisions, I think, are much more restricted in terms of what you can bring to bear on the case. And a promotion to full professor is still more restricted. I mean, you have even fewer criteria that you can bring to bear. Once you've accepted the person is there, they're there, and you have to deal with them. Much as some people do change over time and become impossible, and they weren't impossible 10 years earlier. But it's worth protecting academic freedom is worth surviving difficult people. But I think if the model of academic freedom is that anti-Semitism can't be criticized and can have no professional consequences, I think that's a problem. I think that we're never going to be able to deal with it if we have no ways of responding.
I want to take 3 questions, Cary. So listen carefully. So 3 people are going to ask questions, and then
You're not just asking me to listen carefully, you're asking me to remember, for God's sake.
yeah.
That's the outrageous part.
We made many demands on you, Cary, over the years, as you know, so you're used to it.
Right.
Joe and Sam and Gunther. So the 3 of you, one after another, please.
Thank you, Cary. I'm Joseph Gavitsky from the University of Miami Business School. And in line with your former presidency of EUP, I'm sorry, for which I congratulate you. I'm wondering if you think that AAUP at this time would be willing to endorse your proposals, number 1, and 2, let's say that they were to endorse them, would they have any impact on the operations of different universities?
Sam?
Well, I mean,
Wait.
oh, sorry, whoops.
Sam?
First of all, good to see you, Shana Bunham, Cary.
Hi.
Been a long time. So, I
Good
was
to see you.
successful. Yeah, I was successful in getting the state of Florida Democratic Party to accept the IHRA definition, working definition, this past summer. because of a whole series of anti-Semitic things that happened with mostly with the Republicans. But out of that has come a movement of a bipartisan movement of Jews and non-Jews to make the IHRA legally binding in the state of Florida. What do you think about that?
Okay, and Gunther.
Yeah. Thank you, Cary, so much for a great talk. And the book that you're writing and sharing the chapters with us, I'm particularly glad that you mentioned in depth the impact of online anti-Semitism and how we can, in the academic world, deal with some parts of it. But my question is, so the IRA definition is, I think, a very good tool that is specific enough to that people cannot hide behind saying, well, in general, we are against anti-Semitism because it's very specific. And that's why that's attacked. That's why it's not endorsed. And that's why people make all kinds of arguments in order to be able to continue the defamation of Jews with the goal of erasing Jews from the spaces. And in some spaces that have been a lot of successes. So my question is, what is your observation on the endorsement of IRA definition that has been done by some universities? Is that, do they stand by it, or is that mostly, what in my observation, is mostly a one-off saying, yes, we endorse it, and then you cannot find it anywhere on the website, and yeah, it just disappeared.
Yeah, let me since it's fresh in my mind, let me speak to Gunter first. First of all, Gunter has a group at Indiana University that's really been working hard to develop artificial intelligence protocols for distinguishing between Semitic and anti-Semitic online statements. And I cite his research in the book because it's really important research. So I just shout out to I've learned a lot from Gunter. Early on, there were warnings about IRA's application. And I think in 2016 and 2017, people made some mistakes in how IRA was applied. A number of them took place in Britain. And I think those mistakes were taken to be harboring of the disaster that was to follow. Instead, they operated the opposite way. They convinced people that they should use IRA in a much more limited and thought through way. And it's some of those experiences that are built into the sort of paragraph that I provided. And there are two quite long chapters about IRA in the book, in which I go into it in a lot more detail. In truth, I would say that the institutions that have adopted IRA have underused it. There's a certain amount of like adopting it, putting the plaque up on the student union building, and forgetting to polish the plaque now and again. So I think, if anything, I think it's been underused, not overused, especially after 2016 to 17. And I think we need to think through more about how to use it productively. I think it can be used productively. I give lots of examples of how to use it in the book, and I give a more differentiated description of examples of forms of contemporary anti-Semitism that fit within the broader IRA definition. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done on that. And I'm not happy with the way it's been used so far, but again, mostly because I think it's been underused oddly enough, rather than overused. The accusation is it's been horribly overused and it will get worse, but there's just no evidence that is that's going to be the case. First, again, what was the first question?
On AUP and
Oh,
whether they're
right,
like.
yeah, okay. Yeah, do we have an extra hour? So would the AAUP accept either of these statements? Not on pain of death. No. It's the, I mean, in those of you who got the version of chapter 2 know that I talked about the context of the AUP's change in their view of the status of social media in 2015. And that was really in response to social media participation in one case that was strongly anti-Zionist and arguably in some cases anti-Semitic, sample tweet. If Netanyahu were to appear on the Israeli TV wearing a necklace made of the bones of Palestinian children, would any of us really be surprised? Well, you might think that almost stepped over the line into anti-Semitism. You might be willing to consider that as a possibility. So, and they felt that all of that should be outside criticism. So the context for the AUP's change of policy was really the context of anti-Israel statements, not anything else on social media. That's important to know. Then the thing that I really can't even reference this without kind of, risking the convulsions. The fact that in 2015, the AAUP gave its Faculty Academic Freedom Award to Abdul Hadi from San Francisco State University, who I describe as perhaps the premier case of a US faculty member who has managed to devote every element of her professional activities to anti-Zionism. She probably goes into the school lunchroom carrying a sign against Israeli Hamas, not wanting to avoid politicizing any aspect of her professional life. I mean, that was an extraordinary and an indicative decision on the part of the AAUP. I watched because I was a member of AAUP's Committee A on Academic Freedom and Tenure through 2015. My term there ended 2015, so I was part of all those decisions. At the very end, I just had zero influence on any of them, but I was there. And anti-Zionism played a strong part in a number of decisions that Committee A made during those last couple of years. It was notable that Joan Wallach Scott, who'd been one of the two prime authors of AAUP's statement against academic boycotts, 2 years later, that's 2005, she wrote that, 2006 it becomes public. 2 years later, she reversed herself and said that she was in favor of academic boycotts of Israel. So there's the author of that, co-author of that statement, reversing position. When the longest serving, most distinguished member of the Committee A staff, in a conversation with me outside the meeting itself, when I asked how did he know, since there was no evidence that Jewish donors had really motivated the Salida decision at the University of Illinois, how did he know that they had done so? And he said, because that's what Jews do.
Nice.
And he was the most prestigious member of the staff of the Committee A on Academic Freedom, and a powerful and historically important figure. But there you go. So, I mean, now the only other thing I'll say about AAUP, a little personal story. Some years ago, I wrote an essay never published. I still have it on my computer. And it's about the AAUP's concerted effort to prevent one of my books from being published. And it's No University is an Island, How to Save Academic Freedom. It was issued by NYU. The AUP leadership decided in a case of in a fantasy collective madness that if this book were published, it would destroy the AUP. Nonsense, but people collectively go crazy. Over time on this earth, you learn that groups of people go stark raving mad, which is what happened to the AUP leadership at that point. And with great ferocity, they said they did everything they could to prevent that book from being published. I was president, by the way, of the AUP at the time. I wrote a whole essay about it and didn't publish it, and I still don't know where to publish it. I did it in an animal farm way. I created animal identities for each of the players. The Cowardly Lion and so forth, groups like that, borrowed from other popular culture rather than naming them in most cases. But so, it's AUP did not at the time, nor have they since automatically signed on to any of my beliefs. And I don't, as a rule, count on their doing so. They did a lot of terrific work. I love the organization, a lot of good work, but like other human enterprises, they were sometimes frail.
And the last question is on what your thoughts are about changing the non-legally binding to legally binding and that push in Florida for that.
Well, I think Florida's attempts to take over its universities, but anything short of an air and ground assault, are hugely misguided. I don't think state politicians should be in the business of adjudicating the nature of academic freedom. That's why I think universities need to do a better job of balancing faculty rights with responsibilities. Faculty need to take on that responsibility. I think Florida's efforts to decide that, you can't mention that slavery happened in the United States and a few other bright ideas like that, are just hugely destructive. And even if the governor is only doing it to win plaudits from the Republican base, the efforts don't just die with him. They spread. They spread on social media. They spread. Other legislators may take them up. It's very damaging. I would not want to see IRA become legally binding, because I think really its use is primarily educational, not as a source, not as a disciplinary model. And in my little paragraph, I try to make that clear, that it shouldn't be used that way. And so doing an end run around universities adopting it as legally binding, and instead having the damn state legislature adopt it as university binding, only makes matters worse. Universities have to take some responsibility for self-governance, I think, in this case. And I wouldn't want to see it legally binding in other cases either. I think if it can really be the source of not only long-term education, but long-term rational discussion and analysis and the building of campus and public awareness, that's what we want. It doesn't need to be a cudgel. It hasn't been used really as a cudgel. It doesn't need to be. We have nothing to gain from it, from trying to silence speech. And that's really, if it becomes legally binding, it's a vehicle for silencing speech, and that's not what I'm after. But I'm after some consequences.
Thank you, Cary. That's a perfect note, because I just spoke initially at the start of our meeting about our mission at AEN, and that yes, we combat anti-Semitism. Yes, we seek greater literacy on Israel. and on the Middle East in the academy, but also we are fierce defenders of academic freedom and campus free expression. And it's also the way we present the IHRA definition in our trainings. And when we speak to administrators about it as an educational tool and a useful way for understanding contemporary anti-Semitism. And for that, we're really indebted to you, Cary, for all the work you've done in exposing what's happening in the academy, and particularly on the faculty dimension, which doesn't always get as much attention. We've, stood with you in our disappointment with AUP over that award to Rabab Abdul-Hadi. It was shameful, and if you recall, we wrote a statement to AUP, and of course never heard any response. So we stand with you in your struggle, and we look forward to your next book. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Well, I think we're all on the same page. Good thing.